The sun was setting over the horizon, casting a warm, golden hue across the small coastal town where I lived. It was one of those evenings that felt like it had been pulled straight out of a postcard. Calm waves lapping against the shore, seagulls calling in the distance, and the faint scent of salt lingering in the air. But despite the beauty surrounding me, my mind was elsewhere. I sat on the edge of the pier, letting my feet dangle above the water, staring blankly at the ripples below as if they might hold some kind of answer to the questions swirling inside me. Life had become predictable lately, almost suffocatingly so. Every day followed the same rhythm. Wake up early, head to the diner where I worked, serve coffee and pancakes to tourists who rarely remembered my name, then return home to an empty apartment that echoed with silence. It wasn't bad, it was just stagnant, like I was stuck in this endless loop, unable to break free or even figure out what I wanted instead. Deep down, though, I knew part of the problem was me. I'd spent years burying pieces of myself under layers of excuses and half-truths, too afraid to confront the things I couldn't quite put into words. That's when I first saw him, that he walked onto the pier like he owned it, his boots clicking sharply against the wooden planks. There was something commanding about the way he carried himself, as if the world naturally bent to his will. He wore a leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days, its edges scuffed but still holding on to a rugged charm. His dark hair was tousled by the ocean breeze, and when he turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of his profile. The sharp line of his jaw, the faint stubble along his cheeks, and eyes that seemed to see right through people without hesitation, that I didn't mean to stare, but there was something magnetic about him, something I couldn't look away from. He stopped near the railing not far from where I sat, lighting a cigarette with practiced ease. The smoke curled around him like a second shadow, adding to the air of mystery that clung to him. For a moment, our eyes met, and I quickly dropped my gaze, feeling heat rise to my face. Who was this guy? And why did his presence make my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain? As much as I tried to focus on anything else, the sound of the waves, the distant laughter of children playing on the beach, my thoughts kept circling back to him. There was an intensity about him that both intrigued and unnerved me. Maybe it was the way he stood there, completely unbothered by the world around him, as if he existed in his own orbit. Or maybe it was the fact that for the first time in what felt like forever, someone had actually made me feel something. Not the dull ache of monotony or the quiet sadness that often lingered in the corners of my mind, but something electric, alive. Eventually, he finished his cigarette and flicked the butt into the water before turning to leave. Just as he passed me, he paused, glancing down with a smirk that sent a jolt through my system. "You're blocking the view," he said, his voice low and teasing, tinged with just enough sarcasm to catch me off guard. "I what?" I stammered, looking around in confusion. "What view?" His smirk widened, and he tilted his head toward the sunset behind me. "That one, unless you're planning to sit there all night." My cheeks burned hotter, and I scrambled to stand, muttering an apology as I moved aside. He chuckled softly, brushing past me, and for a brief second, our shoulders brushed. The contact was fleeting, barely noticeable, but it left me frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I turned to watch him go, he was already disappearing down the pier, his silhouette blending into the fading light. It wasn't until later that night, lying awake in bed, that I realized I hadn't even asked his name. The next few days passed in a blur, but no matter how hard I tried to shake it, the memory of that encounter lingered. I found myself replaying it over and over in my mind. The way he'd looked at me, the sound of his voice, the casual arrogance that somehow managed to be charming rather than obnoxious. It was ridiculous, really. I didn't even know him, and yet he'd planted himself firmly in my thoughts, refusing to leave. Then, on the fourth day, fate decided to intervene, that I was working the late shift at the diner, wiping down tables and trying to ignore the dull ache in my feet, when the bell above the door jingled, signaling a new customer. Without thinking, I glanced up and froze. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the evening light, was the man from the pier. He looked different now, dressed in a plain black t-shirt and jeans, but there was no mistaking those piercing eyes or that confident stance. My stomach flipped, and I quickly ducked my head, pretending to focus on the tablecloth in front of me. "Evening," he called out, his voice carrying across the nearly empty diner. A few heads turned, but most of the patrons were locals who either ignored him or nodded in acknowledgement. He slid into a booth near the window, pulling out a worn notebook and pen from his jacket pocket. For a moment, I considered asking someone else to take his order, but curiosity got the better of me. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed a menu and approached his table, forcing a polite smile onto my face. "Hi, welcome to We've Met Before," he interrupted, leaning back in the booth with a lazy grin. "On the pier, you blocked my sunset." My face flushed instantly, and I gripped the menu tighter, suddenly hyper-aware of how flustered I sounded. "Oh, right. Sorry about that." He waved a hand dismissively, his grin softening into something almost playful. "Don't worry about it. I'm sure you'll make it up to me with some decent coffee." "Black, please." I nodded, scribbling down his order before hurrying back to the counter. My hands trembled slightly as I filled his cup, and I cursed myself for acting like a nervous teenager. What was it about this guy that threw me so off balance? Still, I couldn't deny the thrill that coursed through me every time he looked at me, his gaze sharp and unwavering, like he could see straight through my carefully constructed walls. When I brought his coffee over, he thanked me with a nod, his attention already drifting back to whatever he was writing in his notebook. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to say something else, but ultimately decided against it. Instead, I retreated to the safety of the counter, watching him from afar as he sipped his drink and scribbled furiously, occasionally pausing to glance out the window at the darkening sky to be why the time he left, leaving behind a generous tip and a faint trace of cologne that lingered long after he was gone. I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be the last time our paths crossed. Little did I know, it would change everything. The next time I saw him, it wasn't at the diner or on the pier. It was somewhere I never would have expected, a cramped, dimly lit bookstore tucked away in the quieter part of town. I'd gone there to escape the rain that had started pouring unexpectedly, seeking refuge among the musty shelves and forgotten corners of the shop. The air smelled faintly of old paper and ink, a comforting contrast to the chaos outside. I wandered aimlessly, trailing my fingers along the spines of books I had no intention of buying, when I heard his voice. "Looking for something good?" I turned sharply, startled, and found him standing just a few feet away, holding a dog-eared copy of The Sun Also Rises. He looked different here, softer somehow, though the edge of confidence still lingered in the way he tilted his head, his lips curling into an almost smirk. For a moment, I forgot how to speak, caught off guard by the sheer inevitability of running into him again. It felt like the universe was conspiring against me, or maybe for me, though I wasn't sure which yet. Not really. I managed finally, stuffing my hands into my pockets to hide their trembling. "Just killing time until the rain stops." He nodded, as if this made perfect sense, and stepped closer, leaning casually against the shelf beside me. "Smart move. This place is underrated. Most people don't know about it." His gaze flicked down to the book in his hand before returning to me. "You read much?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Reading wasn't exactly my thing, not because I didn't enjoy it, but because life had a way of crowding out hobbies that didn't involve paying bills or surviving day-to-day monotony. Still, something about the way he asked, the genuine curiosity in his tone, made me want to answer honestly. "Not as much as I should," I admitted, shrugging. "But I used to love it when I was younger. Escaping into stories, you know?" His smirk softened into a smile, one that reached his eyes and made them crinkle slightly at the corners. "Yeah, I get that. Sometimes real life feels like too much, doesn't it?" The question hung between us, heavier than it should have been. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how close we were standing, our shoulders nearly brushing. There was something intimate about the moment, as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of us surrounded by rows of dusty books and the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows. "What are you reading?" I asked quickly, desperate to fill the silence. Then he held up the novel, tapping the cover with his thumb. "Hemingway. Classic stuff. You ever read him?" I shook my head. "Can't say I have." "Is it any good?" "It's complicated," he said, his voice dropping slightly, as if sharing a secret. "Beautiful, but brutal. Kind of like life, I guess. The word sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way he said it, with such quiet conviction, as if he'd lived those words himself. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in what felt like forever, someone was speaking to me like I mattered, like my thoughts and opinions carried weight, that we talked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. He told me his name, Eli, and shared bits and pieces of his life. How he'd grown up in a small town not unlike this one. How he'd left as soon as he could to chase dreams that never quite panned out. In return, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't anticipated, telling him about my job at the diner, my lonely apartment, and the suffocating feeling of being stuck in a life that didn't fit. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. That'd be why the time the rain stopped and the shopkeeper announced closing time, I realized I didn't want the conversation to end. But Eli seemed unfazed, slipping the book back onto the shelf with a casual ease that belied the tension crackling between us. "Well," he said, stepping back and shoving his hands into his jacket pockets, "guess I'll see you around." "Wait," I blurted before I could stop myself. My cheeks flushed instantly, but I forced myself to continue. Do you want to grab coffee sometime? Or, not necessarily coffee. Whatever." He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression. Something warmer, softer. "You asking me out, kid?" The word kid stung more than it should have, but I ignored it, focusing instead on the way his lips twitched upward into a teasing grin. "Maybe," I muttered, looking down at my shoes. "If you're interested." For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and I braced myself for rejection, for the polite brush-off that would leave me embarrassed and humiliated. But then he chuckled softly, shaking his head. "All right, coffee sounds good. Give me your number, and I'll text you." My heart leapt, though I tried to play it cool as I rattled off my digits. As we parted ways outside the bookstore, the rain having slowed to a drizzle, I couldn't help but feel like something monumental had shifted. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope, for connection, for understanding, for something more. But hope, as it turns out, is a double-edged sword. That night, lying in bed and replaying every word of our conversation, doubt began to creep in. What was I doing? Who was I kidding, thinking someone like Eli could actually be interested in someone like me? He was magnetic, confident, unapologetically himself, a force of nature. And me? I was ordinary, invisible, the kind of person who blended into the background, who went unnoticed unless it was convenient for others to notice. And then there was the bigger issue, the one I'd spent years avoiding even in my own mind. What if he figured it out? What if he realized what I couldn't bring myself to admit? Not even to myself? The thought terrified me, sending waves of nausea crashing over me as I stared up at the ceiling. I'd always known I was different, but growing up in a town where conformity was king had taught me to bury those feelings deep, to pretend they didn't exist. Coming to terms with them now, especially with someone like Eli, felt like stepping on a thin ice, dangerous, reckless, and bound to break beneath me. Still, despite the fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve, I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward him. There was something about Eli that made me want to take risks, to step outside the safety of my carefully constructed walls and let myself be seen, truly seen for the first time in my life. When his text came the next morning, a simple, "Hey, it's Eli. How about coffee tomorrow?" I hesitated only briefly before replying. "Sure. See you then." As I hit send, I knew I was walking a fine line between exhilaration and disaster. But for once, I didn't care. Whatever happened next, I decided would be worth it. The cafe where we met for coffee was nothing special. A cozy little spot with mismatched furniture, the faint aroma of roasted beans lingering in the air, and a playlist of soft indie music that hummed quietly in the background. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find someone like Eli, who seemed more at home in the raw, untamed corners of the world than tucked away in a quaint corner booth. But there he was, sitting by the window with a steaming mug in front of him, his leather jacket slung over the back of the chair as if he owned the space. He looked up when I walked in, his lips curving into that familiar smirk that made my stomach flip. "You're late," he teased, though there was no real accusation in his tone, just playful amusement. I'm 5 minutes early, I shot back, sliding into the seat across from him. My voice came out steadier than I expected, but inside, my nerves were buzzing like live wires. This felt different from our previous encounters, more deliberate, more charged. For once, it wasn't just chance bringing us together. This was intentional, chosen, and that thought alone was enough to make my palms sweat. Eli chuckled, leaning forward slightly. 5 minutes is still late in my book. His eyes sparkled with mischief, and for a moment, all I could do was stare, struck dumb by how effortlessly he commanded attention. Relax, he said, his smirk softening into something warmer. I'm just messing with you. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and forced myself to smile. Yeah, well, don't scare me like that. I almost bolted before I even got here. Wouldn't have blamed you if you did, he replied, taking a sip of his coffee. The casualness of his words belied the weight behind them, and I wondered briefly what he meant. Did he think I might regret showing up? Or was he simply testing the waters, gauging how serious I was about whatever this was? We spent the next hour talking, or rather, he talked, and I listened, mesmerized by the cadence of his voice and the way his hands moved as he spoke. He told stories about his travels, about hitchhiking through Europe with nothing but a backpack and a dream, about sleeping under the stars in deserts so vast they made him feel both insignificant and infinite. Each tale painted a picture of a man unafraid to chase after life, to embrace its chaos and beauty without hesitation. And what about you? He asked suddenly, interrupting my reverie. What's your story? I blinked, caught off guard by the question. Me? I don't really have one. Just working at the diner, living paycheck to paycheck. Nothing exciting. His brow furrowed slightly, and he leaned closer, his gaze piercing. That's not true. Everyone has a story. Maybe yours hasn't been written yet, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth telling. The sincerity in his voice took me aback, and I found myself fumbling for words. No one had ever spoken to me like that, with such earnest belief in my potential, as if I were capable of more than I gave myself credit for. It was disarming, exhilarating, terrifying all at once. Over the next few weeks, we fell into an easy rhythm. Our meetings became less spontaneous and more planned, though they never lost their sense of adventure. One day, we explored the abandoned lighthouse on the outskirts of town, climbing rusted stairs until we reached the top, where the view stretched endlessly across the ocean. Another time, we drove out to a secluded beach at sunset, skipping stones across the water while sharing childhood memories that neither of us had ever dared to speak aloud before. Each moment felt like a thread weaving us closer together, binding us in ways I couldn't fully articulate. There was something intoxicating about being around him. The way his laughter echoed in my chest, the warmth of his hand brushing against mine as we walked side by side, the way his presence filled the spaces I hadn't realized were empty. But it wasn't just the big moments that stood out. It was the small ones too. The quiet intimacy of sitting in companionable silence. The way his fingers lingered on the rim of his coffee cup as he listened intently to something I said, the subtle shift in his expression when he thought I wasn't looking. These tiny details accumulated, building a foundation of trust and connection that felt both fragile and unshakable. One evening, after a long day at work, I found myself at his apartment, a cramped studio above a bakery that smelled perpetually of fresh bread. We sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by takeout containers and half-empty bottles of beer, discussing everything and nothing. At some point, the conversation turned serious, veering into territory I hadn't anticipated. So, Eli began, his tone deceptively casual. When are you going to tell me what's really going on in that head of yours? I froze, my fork hovering midair. What do you mean? He shrugged, picking at the label on his beer bottle. You got walls, kid. Big ones. And I get it, everyone does. But sometimes it feels like you're holding back, like there's something you're not saying. My throat tightened, and I looked down at my lap, suddenly hyper-aware of the distance between us. He was right, of course, he always seemed to be, but acknowledging it felt like stepping on a shaky ground. How could I explain the tangled web of fear and longing and self-doubt that lived inside me? How could I put into words the part of me I barely understood myself? I started, then stopped, shaking my head. It's complicated. Eli set his bottle aside and leaned forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. Try me. For a long moment, I didn't say anything, torn between the urge to confide in him and the instinct to retreat. Finally, I took a deep breath and let the words spill out. Not everything, but enough. Enough to admit that I was scared, that I didn't know how to navigate the feelings swirling inside me, that I'd spent years convincing myself I didn't deserve happiness because it would only slip through my fingers anyway. When I finished, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I braced myself for judgment, for pity, for anything but the gentle understanding that softened Eli's features. You don't have to figure it all out right now, he said quietly. Just don't shut me out, okay? Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. In that moment, I wanted to believe him, to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as broken as I thought I was. That maybe, with him, I could learn to piece myself back together. Of course, not every moment was heavy. There were plenty of times when Eli's humor broke through the tension, lightening the mood and reminding me that joy could coexist with vulnerability. Like the time he convinced me to join him for karaoke night at a dive bar downtown, despite my protest that I couldn't sing to save my life. By the end of the night, we were laughing so hard we could barely stand, our voices hoarse from belting out off-key renditions of cheesy pop songs, or the afternoon we stumbled upon a farmer's market and ended up buying ridiculous amounts of produce neither of us knew how to cook. Back at his apartment, we attempted to make ratatouille, only to burn half of it and laugh until tears streamed down our faces. The kitchen smelled like charred vegetables for days afterward, but neither of us cared. It had been perfect. These moments weren't just distractions. They were reminders that life didn't have to be all or nothing. That even amidst the uncertainty and fear, there was room for joy, for connection, for hope. And yet, no matter how much progress I made, the shadow of doubt lingered. Every time Eli's hand grazed mine, every time his gaze lingered a little too long, I felt the pull of conflicting emotions, desire warring with fear, longing clashing with self-preservation. I wanted to let go, to trust him completely, but the fear of rejection, of losing what we had, kept me tethered to caution. Still, despite the internal battle raging within me, one thing became increasingly clear. Eli wasn't just someone I enjoyed spending time with. He was becoming someone I couldn't imagine living without. It was one of those nights that felt like it had been pulled straight out of a dream, or maybe a feverish fantasy. The kind of night where the air was thick with electricity, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. We'd spent the evening wandering through the city, aimlessly drifting from one street to another, talking about everything and nothing. Eli had been unusually quiet, his usual confidence tempered by something I couldn't quite place. A hesitancy, perhaps, or a flicker of vulnerability that made my chest tighten every time I caught it in his eyes. By the time we reached the park near the edge of town, the world around us seemed to fade into the background. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing in the distance, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the wind and the faint hum of crickets hidden somewhere in the shadows. We walked side by side along the winding path, our footsteps synchronized, but our thoughts miles apart. Or so I thought. When we stopped at the small bridge overlooking the pond, Eli turned to face me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, taut and fragile, like a thread on the verge of snapping. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing loudly in my ears as I waited for him to say something, anything to break the spell. "You've been different tonight," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is everything okay?" Eli let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. He leaned against the railing, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, and stared out at the water. "I don't know," he admitted after a pause. "Maybe I'm just tired of pretending." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless and disoriented. "Pretending what?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to steady it. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed off the railing and stepped closer, closing the distance between us until we were standing mere inches apart. His gaze locked onto mine, intense and searching, as if he were trying to see past the walls I'd built around myself. This, he said, his voice low and raw. Us. Whatever this is, I'm tired of dancing around it, of pretending I don't feel more. My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was. The warmth radiating from his body, the faint scent of cologne mingling with the cool night air, the way his breath hitched slightly when he exhaled. My mind raced, scrambling to process what he was saying, but my heart already knew. It had known for weeks, maybe even longer, though I'd refused to acknowledge it. I started, then faltered, shaking my head. I don't know what you want me to say. Say you feel it too, he pressed, his tone urgent now, almost desperate. Tell me I'm not imagining this connection between us. Tell me you haven't spent every second of these past few weeks thinking about me the way I've been thinking about you. His words sent a jolt through me, both exhilarating and terrifying. How could he possibly know? How could he see so clearly what I'd worked so hard to hide? Not just from him, but from myself. And yet, here he was, laying it all out in the open, forcing me to confront the truth I'd been running from. I can't, I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of everything I wasn't ready to admit. I can't do this. Eli's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, I thought he might pull away, might retreat behind the same walls I'd erected. But instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine before curling around my wrist. The touch was gentle but firm, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Why not? He demanded, his voice softer now, but no less insistent. What are you so afraid of? Everything. That's what I wanted to say. I was afraid of losing him, of ruining what we had, of being rejected or misunderstood or judged. I was afraid of letting myself feel something so deeply, so completely, that it would consume me whole. But most of all, I was afraid of admitting the truth. Not just to him, but to myself. I'm scared. I admitted finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. Scared of messing this up. Scared of wanting something I don't know how to handle. Eli's grip on my wrist loosened, his fingers sliding down to intertwine with mine. You think I'm not scared too? He asked, his voice tinged with a vulnerability that took my breath away. This isn't easy for me either, you know. But I'd rather take the risk than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning, and for the first time, I allowed myself to truly consider them. What was I holding on to? Fear? Doubt? The illusion of safety? None of it mattered if it meant pushing away the one person who made me feel alive again. Before I could second-guess myself, I closed the remaining distance between us, my free hand reaching up to cup his cheek. His skin was warm beneath my palm, roughened slightly by stubble, and his eyes widened in surprise before softening with something deeper, something unmistakable. And then, without another word, I kissed him that it wasn't perfect. My lips trembled against his, unsure and tentative, and for a split second, I worried I'd misread everything, that he'd pull away, that I'd ruined everything. But then his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming something fierce and achingly tender all at once. It was messy and imperfect and utterly overwhelming, but in that moment, none of that mattered. All that existed was him. The taste of coffee still lingering on his lips, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my chest, the way his hands moved over my back as if memorizing every inch of me. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, I rested my forehead against his, unable to look away. I'm sorry, I murmured, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. For waiting so long? For being afraid? For kissing him in the first place? Eli shook his head, his thumb brushing lightly over my cheekbone. Don't be, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Just don't shut me out again, all right? Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together. I nodded, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, and leaned into him, letting myself be held for the first time in what felt like forever. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the night and the undeniable certainty of his presence, I allowed myself to believe, for the first time, that maybe happiness wasn't something I had to earn. Maybe it was something I could simply choose. The days that followed our kiss were a blur of heightened emotions, each moment tinged with the electric charge of something new and fragile. Everything felt different now, sharper, brighter, more vivid, as if the world had shifted on its axis to accommodate the change between us. But for all the beauty of what we'd shared, the reality of it began to settle in quickly, bringing with it a storm of complications I hadn't fully anticipated. First, it was easy to pretend nothing had changed. We fell into a rhythm of stolen moments, lingering touches when no one was looking, whispered conversations late at night, and secret smiles exchanged across crowded rooms. It was intoxicating, thrilling even, to feel so connected to someone who seemed to understand me in ways no one else ever had. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Eli was patient, almost unnervingly so. He gave me space to process, never pushing me further than I was ready to go, but his quiet understanding only made my insecurities worse. Every time he looked at me with that steady gaze of his, I saw the weight of expectation, not from him, but from myself. What if I couldn't live up to whatever this was? What if I let him down? It didn't help that the outside world wasn't exactly welcoming. Words spread faster than I thought possible, though neither of us had said anything outright. People talked, it's what they do. And soon enough, whispers started making their way back to me. At the diner, customers would glance knowingly at me when Eli walked in, some smirking, others frowning disapprovingly. Even my coworkers, who had always been friendly enough, began treating me differently, their casual banter replaced by awkward silences and sidelong glances. But the worst part wasn't the gossip or the judgment. It was the voice inside my head, the one that whispered cruel truths I couldn't escape. You're not good enough for him. You'll ruin this. Everyone will find out, and they'll hate you. The fear gnawed at me constantly, eating away at the joy I felt whenever I was with him. I tried to push it aside, to focus on the present instead of the future, but it lingered like a shadow, darkening even the brightest moments. One evening, after another long shift at the diner, I found myself sitting alone in my apartment, staring blankly at the wall. My phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table, notifications piling up from texts and missed calls, but I ignored them. I couldn't face anyone, not Eli, not my friends, not even myself. All I could think about was how much easier it would be to run, to retreat back into the safety of invisibility where no one expected anything from me. When the knock came at the door, I froze, certain it was Eli. Part of me wanted to open it, to let him in and tell him everything. That I was scared, that I didn't know how to do this, that I needed him more than I'd ever admit. But another part of me wanted to hide, to protect both of us from whatever disaster I was sure would follow. Instead, I stayed silent, listening as the knocking turned into hesitant footsteps retreating down the hallway. When the sound faded completely, I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. For the first time since meeting Eli, I felt truly alone. The next morning, I woke up to a text from him. "Hey, just checking in. You okay?" I stared at the screen for a long time before typing out a response. "Yeah, just tired." His reply came almost instantly. "Liar. Let me take you somewhere tonight." Pleased that I hesitated, torn between the urge to see him and the instinct to keep my distance. In the end, curiosity won out. "Okay. Where?" "Meet me at the pier," he wrote back. 7 p.m. Don't be late. To be By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. Eli was already there, leaning against the railing with his arms crossed over his chest, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. He didn't say anything when he saw me, just nodded toward the edge of the pier where a blanket and a small picnic basket were laid out. "What's all this?" I asked, gesturing to the setup, but he shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thought maybe we could use a break from everything. No pressure, no expectations. Just us." For a moment, I considered arguing, telling him that running away wouldn't fix anything. But then I caught the look in his eyes, soft, hopeful, determined, and realized he wasn't trying to avoid the problems. He was giving us a chance to breathe, to reconnect without the weight of the world pressing down on us, that we sat together in comfortable silence, sharing slices of bread and cheese while the waves lapped gently against the shore below. The tension between us hadn't disappeared entirely, but it felt lighter somehow, less suffocating. When the food was gone, Eli leaned back on his elbows, gazing up at the stars that had begun to emerge in the twilight sky. "You know," he said after a while, his voice soft but steady, "you don't have to have all the answers right now. None of us do. Life's messy, unpredictable. It doesn't come with a manual. But that doesn't mean you can't figure it out as you go." I glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "And what if I mess it up? Then we'll deal with it," he replied simply, turning his head to meet my gaze. "Together." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me in the best possible way. For so long, I'd been convinced that I had to handle everything on my own, that asking for help, or even accepting it, was a sign of weakness. But here he was, offering me exactly what I needed most: partnership, support, unconditional acceptance. "I'm scared," I admitted finally, the confession spilling out before I could stop it. "Scared of failing, of losing you, of being judged." Eli reached over, his hand finding mine and squeezing gently. "I get it. Trust me, I do. But running from it won't make it go away. And neither will pretending you don't care. The only way through is forward." His advice should have felt cliché, tried even, but coming from him, it carried a weight that resonated deep within me. Maybe he was right. Maybe the only way to survive this, to really live, was to face the fear head-on. No matter how daunting it seemed, still, the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. As much as I wanted to believe in the possibility of happiness, the external challenges weren't going anywhere. My family, for instance, remained an unresolved issue. They'd always been traditional, conservative, and while they'd never outright condemned anyone for being gay, their subtle disapproval of anything different was impossible to ignore. Telling them about Eli felt like opening Pandora's box, unleashing a flood of questions and judgments I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. Work posed its own set of problems. While the initial wave of gossip had died down somewhat, the underlying tension remained palpable. Some of my co-workers continued to treat me with thinly veiled disdain, their discomfort manifesting in passive-aggressive comments and cold shoulders. It was exhausting, demoralizing, and yet another reminder of how far I still had to go before finding any semblance of peace. Despite all of this, though, there were moments of grace, small victories that reminded me why fighting was worth it. Like the day one of my regular customers, an older woman named Margaret, pulled me aside after her meal and told me she thought Eli seemed like a good man. Or the afternoon I caught two of my co-workers laughing together over a joke I'd made, proving that not everyone viewed me differently now. Each of these moments, however fleeting, served as a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink whenever doubt threatened to consume me. And through it all, Eli remained steadfast, his unwavering belief in me becoming the anchor I clung to when everything else felt uncertain. Yet, even as things began to stabilize, questions lingered. Would my family ever accept us? Could I truly overcome the fear that had defined me for so long? And perhaps most importantly, was I strong enough to build a future with someone who deserved nothing less than my whole self? For now, I didn't have the answers. But for the first time, I allowed myself to hope that someday I might. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the world seemed to shrink down to the size of a single room. I was sitting at the kitchen table in Eli's apartment, staring at my phone as if it held all the answers. The screen displayed a text thread with my mom, a conversation that had started innocently enough, but had quickly spiraled into something heavier. She'd asked how work was going, and somehow the topic had shifted to my personal life. Her questions were careful, probing, but not unkind. "Are you seeing anyone? You know you can tell me anything, right?" I'd hesitated before responding, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. For weeks, I'd avoided this exact scenario, dodging family calls and deflecting inquiries with vague excuses. But now, sitting across from Eli, who was quietly sketching in his notebook, oblivious to my internal turmoil, I realized I couldn't keep running forever, so I typed the words I'd been dreading. "There's someone. His name is Eli. The reply didn't come immediately, and for a few agonizing minutes, I wondered if she'd simply ignore the message. Then, finally, her response appeared. Tell me about him. That IT wasn't acceptance, not outright. But it was an opening, a crack in the door I'd been too afraid to knock on. Over the next hour, we exchanged messages, tentatively at first, then more openly. I told her about Eli, about how he made me laugh, how he challenged me to be better, how he saw parts of me I didn't even know existed. She listened, or rather read, and responded with thoughtful questions, her tone cautious, but curious to be why the time we ended the conversation, I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged had begun to lift. It wasn't perfect. There were still hurdles ahead, conversations yet to be had. But for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it could work. Out a week later, I invited Eli to dinner at my parents' house. He raised an eyebrow when I told him, clearly skeptical. You sure about this? He asked, his voice teasing but tinged with concern. Because I don't want to cause any trouble. You won't, I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. They're trying. That's all I can ask for right now. The evening was tense, but not unbearable. My dad shook Eli's hand firmly, his expression unreadable, while my mom fussed over setting the table, her nervous energy filling the silence. Conversation flowed awkwardly at first, punctuated by long pauses and forced smiles, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to ease. Eli charmed them with stories of his travels, his humor disarming even my stoic father, while I watched in quiet awe, marveling at how effortlessly he navigated the situation. After dessert, my mom pulled me aside in the kitchen under the pretense of helping clear dishes. He seems nice, she said softly, her gaze flicking toward the living room where Eli sat chatting with my dad. Different from what I expected, but good. Her words caught me off guard, and I struggled to find a response. Thanks. I managed finally, my voice thick with emotion. That means a lot. She nodded, her lips curving into a small, tentative smile. Just be happy, okay? That's all we ever wanted for you. When she hugged me, I felt the last of my defenses crumble. It wasn't perfect. There would still be moments of discomfort, of misunderstanding, but it was enough. Enough to give me hope, to remind me that love, in all its forms, has a way of breaking down walls if you let it. That in the weeks that followed, life didn't magically become easier. There were still challenges, days when the weight of judgment or fear threatened to pull me under. But they no longer felt insurmountable. With Eli by my side, I learned to navigate the rough patches, to lean on him when I needed strength and offer the same in return. We weren't perfect, not by a long shot, but we were learning. Together, one night, months after that first kiss on the bridge, we found ourselves back at the pier where it had all begun. The air was cool, carrying the salty tang of the ocean, and the stars above shimmered like scattered diamonds against the velvet sky. Eli stood beside me, his arm draped loosely around my shoulders as we gazed out at the water. You remember the first time we came here? He asked, his voice soft but steady. Hard to forget, I replied, leaning into him. You called me kid. He chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. And you blocked my sunset. Still sorry about that. We fell silent after that, content to simply exist in the moment. But as the waves lapped gently against the shore, I turned to him, suddenly struck by the realization of how far we'd come. Not just as a couple, but as individuals. Thank you, I said quietly, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. For what? For believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Eli smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and pressed a kiss to my temple. Always. It wasn't a grand declaration, not some sweeping romantic gesture ripped from a movie script. But it didn't need to be. In that simple exchange, I found everything I'd been searching for: acceptance, understanding, love. Not the kind that comes wrapped in ribbons and bows, but the messy, imperfect, achingly real kind. The kind worth fighting for. As we walked away from the pier, hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, one I hadn't known was possible. Life would always have its challenges, its uncertainties, its moments of doubt. But standing there with Eli, I realized something important. Happiness isn't about having all the answers. It's about finding someone who makes the questions feel less daunting, who reminds you that you're stronger than you think, who loves you not despite your flaws, but because of them. And for the first time in my life, I believed I deserved it.